Dave? Okay. Dave, are we live? Okay. Should I begin? Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in the NUJS Legal Aid Society's lecture series this year. Today, we are thrilled to have with us Dr. Armin Rosencranz. Dr. Rosencranz is currently a professor of law at Jindal. He has a PhD, a JD, and an MA from Stanford, and an AB from Princeton. He has founded and headed the Pacific Environment and Resources Center for 9 years and has also served as a member of former US President Barack Obama's climate change panel. He has taught at US universities such as Stanford and UC Berkeley and has received several accolades for the same. Today, he shall be delivering a lecture on the topic Legislative Assault and the Way Forward Reimagining Environmental Justice in India. This topic becomes incredibly relevant in light of recent developments, most notably the draft Environmental Impact Assessment Notification, which proposes to allow post facto clearance of projects and lessens public participation, amongst other things, and is being severely criticized as a regressive step in environmental policy. We are all incredibly eager to hear Dr. Rosenkranz's thoughts on the topic, and viewers are encouraged to raise their questions on the chat box, and Dr. Rosenkranz shall address them towards the end of the lecture. So without further ado, I shall hand it over to Dr. Rosencranz.
Let's see. First of all, the draft DIA is a disaster. The idea that post hoc equals prompter hoc, I think there's an expression about that. The basic idea is that you can't appropriately talk about something after it's happened and then kind of retroactively include it. And that's what the draft DIA allows. So if you don't like what a particular provision or regulation or legal judgment does, then you can go back under the draft DIA and try to correct it as though it never happened. This is ridiculous. Another ridiculous, well, not ridiculous, but another objectionable part of the draft DIA is the lack of public participation. It seems to me that that the draft DIA is flawed in not adequately enabling the public to participate in numbers and at times that are announced so that they can prepare their presentations. Those are the two issues that I think are the most objectionable. Environmental impact assessment in general is a good thing, but it has to be done not in a formulaic way. It has to be done specifically addressing the issues in front of them in a particular case or consent order or controversy. To do it any other way is a mistake. So now let me also address some other aspects of environmental law and regulation and litigation. In general, I'm sort of an international environmental law person. I've written a lot about it. You may want to refer to my article with two other co-authors called, I believe it's called, well, it's called Environmental Norms, maybe the origin and evaluate, well, it's something, the origin and influence perhaps of international environmental norms. That appeared last year in the Environmental Law Reporter, which is an American environmental journal. And you can find it by checking probably the Environmental Law Reporter and my name under Google. You probably pick it up that way. That is, I think, a very useful tool because it discusses things like the precautionary principle, public trust doctrine, the, what else? Those two particularly. Also, the idea that you have to clean up your environmental damages at the source. So those three principles are discussed at length in that article. Okay, now another thing that I would like to share with you is that there are, in the world today, the most pressing issues are international, and they require cooperative international action. We don't have a mechanism, we don't have an agreement on cooperative international action. So basically, it is up to each country to use domestic law and enforcement to introduce any of these international concepts, including biodiversity and the loss of it, including climate change and its impacts. So these issues need to be addressed. At best, with an international agreement, which we don't have. But the fallback position is to have each country use its domestic law and enforcement to carry forward these issues, including climate change and biodiversity conservation. In my view, climate change impacts are probably the most important issue with an environmental connection in the world today. There are no regular standards governing climate change. We know about it. We've known about it for a good 30 years, but we haven't been able to address it in a cooperative international way. So each country is going to do what it thinks it best needs to do, and that depends on a variety of pressures. For example, from NGOs, from environmentalists, from scholars, even from corporations, because corporations are required to adhere to corporate social responsibility, and that typically is the entry for environmental action. Now, climate change will have its impacts felt over the rest of the century and beyond. Among the impacts, for example, one of those that I worry about is the loss of cropland. Now, you may know that when a river reaches the sea, it has a delta, and the delta is typically the most productive cropland. So, but because of climate change, and one of its consequences is sea level rise and saltwater intrusion into coastal areas, it is very possible that the salt water will prevent the growth of any kind of agriculture. Agriculture requires fresh water, and salt water inhibits or eliminates that kind of growth. So that's one thing that disturbs me. Another thing is the loss of species. Climate change has brought about a terrific loss of species in the world. Right now, we're feeling it among insects, bats, rodents, and so on. But eventually, it's going to reach larger plants and animals, and possibly at some point will impact humans, particularly those living in vulnerable places. One of the other impacts of climate change is the production of refugees. Refugees are generated by people who live near the coast and are impacted by saltwater intrusion and sea level rise, losing often their livelihoods and their homes. So what do? They try to migrate to other places where these problems are reduced. One of the other impacts of living along near the coast is reduced access of water. Though climate change has really shifted a lot of the world's hydrology, more droughts, more floods, less rainfall or too much rainfall. All of this is resulting from climate change impacts. And it means that some people are going to not have enough water to survive or to feed their animals or to tend their crops. And without water, the trees on which they also rely for building materials and water storage are not going to be available. Trees can't survive without adequate water. So those are two or three of the larger impacts that I see as cause to worry. The answer, of course, is renewable energy. If we had renewable energy, we wouldn't need to use fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. The transport sector would be the only sector that probably could manage, which doesn't need renewable energy, because coal and oil, coal gasified and oil are the drivers of all vehicles. And you know, we definitely want vehicles that don't produce greenhouse gas emissions. So the greenhouse gas emissions is what brings about, which accelerates climate change and accelerates the impacts of climate change. So if we had electric vehicles in the transport sector, and if we had renewable energy in the energy sector, much of our problems with climate change and its impacts would go away. And this includes not only climate change, but also biodiversity, which is limited, which is depleted largely by the impacts of climate change. So we would have much more biodiversity. We'd be able to deal with one of the problems that I've written about recently is the tiger trade. Now, the tiger trade, by which I mean trading in tiger parts, also rhino horns, also elephant tusks, harm, of course, the biodiversity in the world. Tiger parts are actually traded largely from India, is the main exporter of tiger parts, much of it illegal. And the main importer of tiger parts is China, where they have I believe, mythical belief that tiger bones and skins and other parts will increase male virility. I think this is a myth. I'm actually in the process of writing an article about this with the help of some of my colleagues. So you should be looking for that at some point in the next few months. The myth of tiger and rhino parts increasing and expanding male virility in the human population. Let's see what else I want to tell you. I'd like to mention that young people, particularly teenagers, are bringing lawsuits all over the world to try to force governments to address climate change more effectively than they are doing. This is happening in India with the Rashima Pandi case. It's happening in the Netherlands, Colombia, Pakistan. The US has a big case brought by young people against the government. The Philippines is another country which is involved in this. So realizing that young people are involved in international climate litigation is important. They're also involved in green entrepreneurship, involved in dealing with plastic waste. Young people, and Miranda Wang has developed a sound, scientifically and technically efficient way to deal with plastic. Another young person, Arjit Dupar, has worked out a way to curb air pollution. So this is an amazing set of contributions from the younger people in our communities. You know about probably that Greta Thunberg is one of the leaders of climate change remediation, and she's a Swedish woman of, I think, maybe 18 or 19 years old. She's been doing this for the last 3 or 4 years. Another thing to be concerned about, we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. In my view, these goals are highly aspirational, but they're not able to be put into operation. They're, statements of, let's do more for women, let's do more for the environment, but they don't tell you how to implement any of these goals, how to change behavior, how to change public policy, how to involve governments at the national, state, and local level, and at the community level to make a difference here. Okay, now what we want to have is more volunteering by all sorts of people, especially young people, working with NGOs, particularly environmental NGOs and advocates, as well as government, NGOs, corporations, all have an interest in having more environmental protection and sustainable development. In the United States, climate change is not being adequately addressed. However, whenever a corporation wants to start or expand its infrastructure, it must address climate change as part of the environmental impact assessment. This is not true in India. It ought to be. India ought to have in its environmental impact assessment the requirement that any change, that any expansion in a company's plant must address global climate change and its impacts. Okay, let's see if I have anything else to share with you. Well, we do have in the international legal world any number of, again, aspirational instruments. For example, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which addresses, well, which has two aspects that are important for all of us: common but differentiated responsibility, which means that the richer countries must help the poorer countries to address climate change and climate change's impacts. The other is the general idea in the Framework Convention on Climate Change to limit anthropogenic emissions. Anthropogenic meaning human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases. In other words, not coming from natural processes. So those are some of the Framework Convention on Climate Change is probably the most important of the international instruments dealing with international issues like climate change. Another one is the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, which is the main international instrument, not very effective, but it is the only really international instrument addressing biodiversity conservation. But in all of these cases, the issues are addressed separately rather than collectively, and each country has to separately address each of these issues, like biodiversity conservation and climate change, and also renewable energy. I see that there's a question here. How can an effective regulation be brought about for tackling human-animal conflict? Good question. I don't know that I have any particular answer. NGOs and environmentalists are worried about this, and that has to be, we have to develop strategies and policies to deal with it. Actually, in my program, the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability, it's a new program. It's being launched next month or this month, later this month. It will address that question among four others. In other words, the first question, human-environment interaction, is one thing that we will try to address in our courses. We already have a course designed to address this, which will be taught the beginning of September and for the whole fall semester. We also will have courses in introducing ecology, which is like biology, demography, and science in general. Another course on climate change and renewable energy. Another course on environmental law, regulation, and court decisions. And finally, a course on forests and wildlife, protecting wildlife and making sure that the forests are not cut down to the point where, the forests and soil are the two ways to conserve carbon, sequester carbon, protecting the earth from having more carbon pollution in the atmosphere. So if you have intact forests and you decide not to cut them down, you will be able to keep that carbon sequestration function in the forests. Soils are another way to conserve carbon. Typically, when people plow the land, they turn over the topsoil. Turning over the topsoil, however, releases all the carbon when you plow the topsoil. One way around that is to use methods to deeply inject the seed. It's called conservation tillage. It's deep injection of the seed below the topsoil so that you don't have to turn over the topsoil and release the carbon that it contains. So these are some strategies. There are many, in fact. Cows, for example, all domestic animals, but especially cows, release a lot of carbon both in manure and in farting. So one way to try to stop that is to capture the manure in manure digesters and turn that manure into energy. So that is happening. It's somewhat costly. It's a costly initially, but once you've done it, it's a long-term benefit for everybody. Are there other questions that I'm able to address? Another thing to remember is that we have in India the Ministry of Environment, Forestry, and Climate Change. That is really a misnomer. It is rather a ministry. The Ministry of Environment is actually the Ministry of Development. I've talked to all the senior officials in the Ministry of Environment, and it's clear that their main objective is to prefer development over the environment. They don't actually come out and say that, but that's their objective. What else can I share with you? We can use the market to help in shaping environmental protection. We can have subsidies in the market to benefit those who care for the environment. We can have subsidies for renewable energy, which would answer the main problem of fossil fuel greenhouse gas production. So those are some of the issues that I have already shared with you, and am happy to answer any questions. Some of you may be interested in learning more about the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability, which I'm heading at the moment. You can also write to me, very simple email address, Armin, ARMIN, at stanford.edu, Stanford, the university. Okay, any questions? I hope some people are listening to this.
So yeah, we've received another question. It's regarding what your opinion is on the government's excessive discretionary power under the new EIA, and their justification claiming that the excessive environmental regulation leads to red tapeism. So that was that justification for releasing the new EIA. So what was your opinion on that?
Well, the idea that environmental regulation leads to red tapeism is really not true. The new EIA is something of a disaster. I've already mentioned two of its defects: the trying to remedy issues after they've manifested themselves, rather than what we would call the precautionary principle, which is to try to anticipate things before they happen, remedy them. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So try to prevent them from happening in the first place. So what the draft EIA now does is not recognizing that principle as a foremost principle, but rather allowing whatever happens to be remedied after the fact, probably inadequately remedied. So that is something that I worry about. Red tapeism, well, we don't have enough environmental regulation to cause much red tape. We just have the Air Act, the Water Act, the Environmental Protection Act. Those are pretty straightforward. The Supreme Court and the lower courts in India use those to interpret environmental issues. We have the National Green Tribunal, which I'm actually writing about. I'm preparing a book with one of my younger colleagues. And the National Green Tribunal addresses all environmental issues quite effectively, and it has pretty good up to now, it's had really good leadership. Former Justice Swatanta Kumar, who is now a member of the Jindal faculty, was a great leader. I don't know his successor is named Goel, and his successor is not yet established a record. I can't imagine that he'd be quite as strong a leader as Swatanta Kumar, but I'd be happily surprised if that weren't the case. Karishma, do you have another?
So we have another question from a professor. He asks, environmentalism in India has been critiqued as elite-driven, as reflected in the divide on the Forest Rights Act. What can legal academia do to bridge that divide and address the concerns of the Adivasis?
Okay, the Forest Rights Act, interestingly, was moribund, was not used for 7 years. The Forest Rights Act of 2006 was never referred to for all that time. However, in the Vedanta case, 2013, Vedanta is a UK-based industry that was focused on the Nirramgiri Hills, which has a lot of bauxite. And bauxite is the precursor to aluminum. Vedanta is a major producer of aluminum. So Vedanta wanted to take away, intrude on the Nirramgiri Hills, which also has a freedom of religion aspect, because a community dwelling on the Nirramgiri Hills believes that their god inhabits the peak of those hills. But besides that, the most important thing is that the locals were going to have to give up their land to Vedanta to make to convert to mine the bauxite and convert it to aluminum. And the Supreme Court had earlier allowed this with the cooperation and collusion of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. But in the Vedanta case, the second Vedanta case, the first one I think was in 2006, the second case was in 2013, and miraculously, probably amicus curiae brought to the court's attention that the Forest Rights Act of 2006 is available for local people to sue or to have a referendum to get consent of the local people for any conversion of land to corporate interests. This is a major, typically the court would allow conversion of private land for public purposes, generally to benefit corporations. But here, the idea was to convert private land to the public interest to benefit local people. And it required a referendum among the local people, the Gram Sabhas, which took place, and 12 Gram Sabhas unanimously recognized that the local people did not want corporate intrusion into their lands. So the lands were left intact, and they quoted the Forest Rights Act of 2006 to make this happen. Anyone else have any questions about?
Yes, so we have a question. This is from Sushovan. He asks, there's another bill, a surreptitious bill, which is the draft National Fisheries Policy. And the provisions of this bill allow for leasing out common water resources to private entrepreneurs. So he wants to know, how do you believe that this would affect the industry, the privatization of these common water resources?
Well, problem is that water is not reliably replenished. It requires rainfall and renewal of rivers and streams and lakes, and that is problematic in this time of climate change. Rainfall is not as reliable as it ever was. We have earlier winters, longer summers, so the result is that we don't have reliable replenishment of our water supply. In addition, the groundwater is often full of toxic chemicals, zinc, and other toxic metals are typically spoil groundwater resources and make some of it not even available, particularly near the bottom of the well. So obviously this is going to have an effect if you don't have enough water and renewal of lakes, rivers, and streams, and water that is also stored by trees. If you don't have enough of it, it's going to mean that the fisheries are going to be harmed. In addition, you have hydropower. Now, hydropower is fairly clean, and I believe that solar, wind, nuclear, and hydro are the renewable energy sources. But one of the problems with hydropower is that the water that's released by a dam, it typically comes from the bottom of the reservoir attached, or the lake attached to the dam. That water is very cold, and cold water doesn't sustain fish. So a lot of the fish will die when you release cold water from the dam. In addition, the water will become muddy because a flowing river will sustain the banks, but without a regular flow, with an interrupted flow, particularly caused by the hydro dam, you're going to get the banks collapsing. And the collapsing banks will, of course, introduce mud into the flowing river. Next question.
So we have a question from Sudev. He asks, whenever legislative or executive action on the environment is floated, the debate becomes a dichotomy between development and the environment. So he asks whether you think that such a binary is the best way to capture the merits of environmental policy.
We have all got to pressure all legislative bodies. Communities must pressure their city, their town councils, their village, their Gram Sabas, their state and local governments, their central government to deal with these issues. You can't, it doesn't, environment and development, you can have development without losing environmental protection. We call it sustainable development for short. Governments are involved with this, and local people, communities must pressure all government bodies to pay attention to the sustainable part of the sustainable development equation. Yes, does that answer? I'm happy to talk more about this.
I think that was satisfactory. So
Okay.
we have a kind of specific question. This is from Simran, and she asks, post the Kerala elephant case, the stakeholder community of the villagers were at the receiving end of much slandering. So, do you believe that social media activism can contribute towards helping these stakeholders, these communities?
Absolutely. Community activism using social media is vital to protecting not only people, but all the animals and plants that are under their control. Elephants are often targeted for their ivory. It's one of the disasters of biodiversity conservation that elephant ivory and tiger parts and rhino horns are all involved in Well, the elephant ivory will be for decoration and piano keys and, other decorative functions. Uh, Elephant ivory doesn't have any inherent human benefit other than exploitation for decoration. Tiger parts, again, as I said earlier, and rhino horns have absolutely no benefit uh, to human beings by ingesting the parts. All they do is reduce the number of tigers in the wild. And we already have only something like 4,000 tigers in the wild, 3,000 of which live in the Sundarbans here in India and Bangladesh. Uh, so, that's shocking. We have something like nearly 8 billion human beings and only 4,000 tigers left in the wild. So I think that those are extraordinarily important, and we need to protect the elephants and the tigers and the rhinoceros. Karishma.
So I think that's about it with the questions. We have one question asking about the objectives of the Jinda School of Environment and how lawyers and law students can be agents in the fight against environmental degradation. And that's our final question.
Okay. Well, one of the things that's important is to recognize that there are jobs available in the environment and in sustainability. All governments will certainly need the abilities of environmentally sensitive and environmentally trained young people. Corporations will need them to perform corporate social responsibility and to address environmental impact assessments dealing with their work. NGOs will need a constant renewal of personnel. Scholars, faculty, teaching at the elementary, high school, and college level will need environmentally trained people. My school will, as I think I said before, have 5 courses, one on forests and wildlife, one on environmental laws, regulations, and court cases, one on climate change and energy, one on human environment interaction, and finally one on ecology, which is basically science, biology, demography. So we try to include all that we can. We also just created, in the last few days, an environmental law and science advocacy clinic, urging people from all over India to participate in these issues. One of them is going to certainly be the draft environmental impact assessment, to try to critique it and try to persuade government people to redraft and improve this horrible environmental impact assessment notification.
So we just have one final question, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
It's from Sushant, and he asks, so with regards to international environmental climate actions, how do you believe that the exit of US from the Paris Climate Agreement is going to affect international efforts?
First of all, we only have to worry about this for another 3 months, because I am fairly certain that Trump, who withdrew the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, will be defeated handily in November, 3 months away. And once he's out, his successor will certainly restore American involvement in the Paris Climate Agreement. He's already announced that that would be one of his objectives. So I think that not to worry about that. We have to worry about it for another 3 months, but after that, or 5 months actually, when we get, because the new president will only be installed on January 20th of 2021. But that's not that long to wait, another 5 months. And by that time, we'll have not only America's involvement in the Paris Climate Agreement, but active involvement in reducing greenhouse gas emissions through all sorts of domestic policies and cooperating with other countries around the world to participate actively in the fight against climate change impacts and the promotion of renewable energy.
Thank you, sir. I think that was our final question. And we'd like to thank you again for taking the time out to join us. I'm just going to hand it over to Dipto, sir, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Karishma. Thank you, Dr. Rosencranz. We at NUJS have...
Armin. Everybody calls me Armin.
I'm sorry, sir?
Everybody calls me Armin.
Right. We've always had the pleasure of having you over for a number of these events. So for me, it wasn't the first time that I get to hear you speak on these issues. But as is typical of Armin, it was a lucid and interactive session where he covered so many different aspects of and from pisciculture onto the EIA, onto the Paris Agreement. So I think our viewers today learned a lot. So thank you very much for taking out this time for us. And we would really hope that we get to hear more of you in the future, now that you're absolutely set in India and running the environmental clinic at Jindal.
Thank you.
Yeah. So to the members of the Legal Aid Society who have arranged for these set of lectures at such short notice, to Ketan, Simran, Sushovan and Karishma, thank you very much for getting this off the ground. And to all our viewers who had tuned in to listen, both my colleagues as well as my students, and apart from that, all the other viewers who had come in and joined us from outside, a recording will be up, of course, for you to be able to access the lecture at any time. So with that, we conclude today's session. Thank you very much again, sir, and to everyone else out there. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you for having me.